Alrighty, well, Professor Yujin Nagasawa, thank you very much for joining me, sir.
Thank you for having me again.
I appreciate you. If you wouldn't mind by beginning by introducing yourself and the kind of work you've been up to recently.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy and Kingfisher College Chair of the Philosophy, Religion, and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma. Last time when we met, I just arrived here, but I have been here for now 8 months. And I specialize in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion mainly. And yeah, over the last few years and months, yeah, I've been working on the problem of evil mainly, and I presume that's a topic that we will discuss today.
Nope, that's right.
Yeah,
That specifically in regards to your most recent book
yeah,
titled "The Problem of Evil for Atheists."
yeah. So this book has just been published, and it was published by Oxford University Press, and it's an open access title, which means that you can download the whole book in PDF for free.
Mhm.
So you don't need to buy my book, but I would like you to read my book because it's for free.
Wonderful. And I will mention that you also personally paid the expense, right, to have that done. So it was a generous act on your part. I
Yeah.
appreciate that.
Yes, it's based on a project that was funded by the John Templeton Foundation. So I should thank the foundation for supporting my research.
Wonderful. And before we get into the actual thesis of your book, I think it would be useful if we just begin kind of at a broad level. What do philosophers mean when they talk about the problem of evil?
Yeah, so the problem of evil is normally presented as a challenge for theists, because theists believe that the world was created by God, who is all powerful and all loving. But if we look around, there are horrific events like wars, crimes, natural disasters, uh, and the existence of evil or pain and suffering seems to be incompatible with their belief in God. Because if God is all powerful, then God could have created a better world. God could eliminate pain and suffering in the world. And if God is all loving or all good, then he wouldn't choose to create a world like this. So how come there is evil in this world?
Mhm.
And this is the problem of evil. And many philosophers, including theistic philosophers, believe that this is probably the most significant challenge for theism.
Mhm. Yeah, and as you mentioned, what we'll be talking about here primarily is how philosophers have addressed it, especially in recent literature in the philosophy of religion. But I think one of the things that's unique about this challenge to theism is it's one that's very common, right? Like the
Mhm.
average Joe, I think at some point any thinking person will raise the question to themselves: Why do good things happen
Mhm.
to bad people?
Yeah.
Right. And so this is a very that version of it is a very pervasive
Mhm.
issue for people that thinking about these questions.
Yeah, so that's the core of the problem of evil, I think. Philosophers like the problem of evil because they like puzzles,
Mm.
and the problem of evil is a good puzzle. On the one hand, many people believe that God created the world, but on the other hand, there is evil in this world, and these two facts seem to be incompatible, and we have to solve this puzzle.
Mhm.
But also, the problem of evil raises an existential concern for many people. Why bad things happen to good people, and that's a good question. And how come the world seems to be so unfair and violent? And I think that's the core of the problem of evil.
Mhm. And I do want to get into the distinction between evil and suffering. That'll come later in our
Mhm.
conversation. But that, for the purposes of what we've just described, you in your book and many other philosophers sort of use the terms
Mhm.
interchangeably.
Mhm.
But as far as introducing the problem of evil, is there anything else you'd like to add just by first pass?
Yeah, so probably the term evil is a little bit uh, possibly Christian centered, because there is this idea that evil is the exact opposite to God.
Mm.
That's why the problem of evil appears intensely, especially for Judeo-Christian theists. That's why I tend to prefer to use the phrase pain and suffering instead of evil, because by evil I don't necessarily mean some specific entity that opposes God. What I mean is that pain and suffering that are realized in horrific events in the world. So I
Okay.
think pain and suffering that's more neutral
Mhm.
than the term evil.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, and we'll expand on that further. But by way of introducing your idea, what is your novel contribution to the problem of evil?
So many philosophers, they have theistic philosophers, they have tried to respond to the problem of evil. So they developed many theodicies as responses to the problem of evil. So some people say that there has to be evil because God had to create free humans because freedom is intrinsically good. But because humans are free, they do good things and bad things, and therefore there is evil. There are wars and crimes, but God is not responsible. So the existence of evil is not a problem for theists. Or some other people would say that evil is necessary for our spiritual growth. So this is called the not free will theodicy, but the soul-making theodicy. So in order for us to be spiritually mature, we have to experience evil. That's why God had to allow evil. But this is necessary, so it's not incompatible with the existence of God. Some other philosophers would say that our knowledge is quite limited. We cannot fully understand what God had in mind in allowing evil or creating a world including evil. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't have any good justification. So, for example, here's an analogy. So, suppose that a small child has to go through a painful dental surgery, and then she doesn't understand why she has to go through this painful experience, and she might think that this is evil. But that doesn't mean that the parents don't have any good reason for allowing this. And similarly, maybe God has good reason, but we just don't understand because our knowledge is limited. We don't understand everything about morality or God's purpose. And this is a response called skeptical theism. So there are many theistic responses to the problem of evil in the literature. But my contribution is that it's not that I develop a new response to the problem of evil. In fact, I think that it's very difficult to develop a successful response to the problem of evil. Mm. But I argue that the problem of evil is not a problem just for theists. So I say that there are different versions of the problem of evil for people who accept alternatives to theism, including pantheism, panentheism, axiarchism, and even atheism as well.
And so, what do you mean by the term axiological expectation mismatch?
Yeah, so that's my terminology. So I say that the problem of evil is based on axiological expectation mismatch. So for theists, there is this traditional problem of evil because they expect that the world has a high axiological value. So they believe that God created the world and God is all powerful and all loving. So their expectation is naturally pretty high. They would assume that the world is really amazing. But when they encounter natural disasters or horrific crimes, they suddenly realize that actually this world is pretty bad. So there is a gap between their expectation and observation. And this gap creates the problem of evil. Mm-hmm. And a similar gap can arise for other people too. So, for example, pantheists believe that the world is God. So pantheists don't think that there is God who created the world, but they say that the world is amazing and this world is identical with God. So God is the world rather than God created the world. But the question is, how can we say that the world is God if the world contains so many horrific things? Another example is a version of the problem of evil for axiarchists. So axiarchists claim that the world exists because it's good that it exists. It's a quite unusual view, but the idea is that when we try to provide a causal explanation, causal or metaphysical explanation of why there is this world, we can always end up having an infinite regress. So if you say that there is this world because of this reason, then you can wonder why there is this cause of this world, and you have to explain it further. So we cannot have a fully satisfactory metaphysical explanation of why there is this world. And axiarchists think that there is an ethical requirement for the existence of the world. So there's some kind of axiological or metaphysical foundation of the existence of the world. So the world exists because it's good that it exists. But then the question is, how come there is evil? How come the world is full of pain and suffering if the world is meant to be good? If goodness is the source of existence, then how come the world doesn't seem to be that great? So that's a version of the problem of evil for axiarchists.
Okay. And I think it would be useful if we discuss also the difference between the logical problem of evil and the evidential problem of evil, because that'll come up as well.
Right. Yeah. So J.L. Mackie is an Australian/British philosopher, an atheist philosopher, who introduced the logical problem of evil. So he said that the problem of evil is a logical problem for theists because the existence of evil and existence of God are logically incompatible. But many philosophers think that this formulation is too strong. And in the 1960s and 70s, Alvin Plantinga introduced the free will defense, which is an attempt to show that the problem of evil cannot be a logical problem. So his free will defense goes something like this. So God, the following scenario is logically possible. So freedom is intrinsically great. So when God decided to create the world, he decided to create the world including free human agents like us. And here freedom means morally significant freedom. So freedoms to do good things and bad things. But as an outcome of that, people sometimes perform morally right things, but sometimes they perform morally wrong things. That's why there are crimes and wars in this world. How we can explain natural evil is contentious here, but it is possible, logically possible, that God also created the devil and Satan and evil spirits, and these beings are also free, morally significantly free, because freedom is a good thing to have. And because of that, these very powerful free beings, they sometimes create earthquakes and other forms of natural disasters like tornadoes and so on. So that's why there is evil in the world. And Plantinga says that this is just a logical possibility. So he's not saying that this is an actual scenario, but that's sufficient. It's sufficient to say that this is a logically possible, logically coherent scenario, which suggests that God and evil can coexist. It's logically possible that God and evil coexist, which means that Mackie's formulation of the logical problem of evil is not successful. And many philosophers, including atheistic philosophers, agree with Plantinga. And then they say that, Mackie's formulation is a little bit too strong. So we shouldn't formulate the problem of evil in terms of the logical compatibility or incompatibility between God and evil. So instead, we should formulate it as an evidential problem. So the evidential formulation of the problem of evil goes like this. So the existence of evil doesn't logically contradict the existence of God, but nevertheless, evil is strong evidence against the existence of God. So looking at the world, again, there are a lot of horrific things, and this constitutes strong evidence against the existence of God. So even though it doesn't logically contradict the existence of God, it undermines the justification for believing in the existence of God as an all-powerful and all-loving being. So that's the evidential problem of evil. And many contemporary philosophers tend to focus on the evidential problem of evil rather than the logical problem of evil.
Mhm. And it's worth mentioning that in your book, you make the problem of evil even stronger in a sense, right?
Mm.
Because as you mentioned, those
Mm.
examples of like natural
Mm.
disasters and wars and things, I mean, these are particular events in
Mm.
time, but the case you make for what you
Mm.
call the
Mm.
systemic problem of evil is
Mm.
much more pervasive. So if you could
Right.
expand
Yeah.
on that.
So the first step in my argument is to introduce a new formulation of the problem of evil. So typically, traditionally, when people formulate the problem of evil, they focus on World War II or some horrific events like the Boxing Day tsunami in Southeast Asia. So these are specific instances of evil, or they talk about more generally about natural evil in general, like uh, tornadoes and earthquakes, or moral evil in general, like crimes and wars. But I want to focus on what I call systemic evil. So I focus on evolution and natural selection. And then I say, okay, our existence is dependent, nomologically dependent on evolution and natural selection because we are products uh, of this biological process. But the evolution and natural selection seem to necessitate pain and suffering for uncountably many uh, organisms, including humans. So it looks like the world is not just, it's not just that the world includes some horrific things by accident. It's almost guaranteed that the world contains horrific things.
I think it is worth
Yeah.
spelling out
Mm,
what those are because so
mm,
some of them would be like disease,
mm,
predation,
yeah,
infant animals dying at
yeah,
birth by painful death and stuff like that. So I mean,
yeah,
there's a lot of it that gives it the description of being red tooth and claw and
yeah,
so
that's
forth.
right. Yeah. So nature is a very dangerous place. It's also extremely unfair as well.
Mm-hmm.
So an analogy is that you have a big cage and you put many different kinds of animals there, and you put only a limited amount of resources, and you lock the cage and see which animals will survive. And this is a cruel thing to do, but nature is almost like that. There's always a limited amount of resources, and organisms have to compete for survival. That's why uh, there is always pain and suffering. And our human existence is dependent on that. I mean, we have uh, disease and all sorts of uh, bad things as a consequence of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and also, our very existence is dependent on pain and suffering for many other animals as well.
Okay.
So in a way, this is often I feel like nature is really horrible, and I wish it wasn't like that. And, that's the base of the problem of systemic evil. And I think this is a very strong challenge for theists at first, because again, theists believe that the world was created by an all-loving, all-powerful God. Uh, but the system itself, this fundamental system, is horrific. And how could you say that God created this system which guarantees pain and suffering?
And so I think it's fairly intuitive why it would be an issue, why the
Mm.
systemic problem will be an issue for atheists, but
Mm.
why do you say it's also a problem for atheists?
Right. So this is another unique aspect of my argument. So this is the second step. So the first step was to establish the problem of systemic evil for theists, but now I expand the scope of the problem so that it would apply to atheists as well. I don't say that this applies to all atheists, but many theists. Many theists who embrace a certain kind of optimism. And by optimism, I mean the view that the world is overall and fundamentally good, or at least not bad. So optimists here believe that it's not true that the world is really fundamentally and overall horrible. There are some bad aspects, which is undeniable, but overall and fundamentally, we are living in a world that is at least not bad. Uh,
Do you mind substantiating why you attribute that to atheists?
there are several reasons, but first, many atheists, even like quite powerful atheists like Richard Dawkins, they appear to be optimists. They often say that we live in this amazing world. If you observe nature, we can appreciate its beauty, and we should be grateful to be alive. And he even says that he almost feels that he is thankful to nature or the universe, even though he doesn't think that the nature is an agent. So he says that it's not really literally appropriate to say that he attributes gratefulness and gratitude or thankfulness to nature itself, but nevertheless he said he has almost a feeling of worship. I think this implies that he's some kind of optimist as well. He doesn't say that this world is really horrific, therefore we shouldn't exist. There are some quite pessimistic atheists like David Benatar. So he says that existence is a harm. When we exist, there is significant amount of pain and suffering. So it's better if we don't exist, and it's better if we don't procreate. And they are pretty straightforward atheistic pessimists. And then I say that their views are consistent with the existence of systemic evil. So my problem of systemic evil doesn't arise for them. But many other atheists, they are optimists, according to my classification. But I claim that they have to take systemic evil seriously.
I think it is worth mentioning. We talked a little bit about him the last podcast we did, but so Arthur Schopenhauer would be another example of one of these pessimistic atheists who believes we live in the worst of possible worlds.
That's right.
That things couldn't get worse.
Yeah, he's an interesting scholar. So he says that this world is really, really bad. This is the worst possible world
because it literally couldn't get worse without like falling
that's
apart.
Right. Yeah. If this world, if you try to make this world worse, this world vanishes. Yes. So this is a perfectly worst possible. It's almost like the fine-tuning argument for the worst possible world.
Yes.
Which is, for me, it's quite interesting because that also means that this is possibly the best possible world as well for him. Because if this is the only possible world that could exist, which turns out to be really bad, maybe metaphysically speaking, this is the only possible world.
That's interesting.
So in one way, it's the best possible world, but another way, it's the worst possible world as well.
Yes, but it is worth mentioning. So both Benatar and Schopenhauer are minority views, even among atheists.
Yeah.
Right?
So in a way, I respect these philosophers who embrace this kind of quite extreme position.
Yes,
but I think that's consistent with what we observe in the world. Because I'm kind of, part of me agrees with them that this, in some respects, this world is really horrific, and the foundation of our existence is quite horrific, and this makes me quite anxious.
Sure. Yeah. And so far we've gone through the first two steps of it. The next move you make is to say that theist is better situated than the atheist. Could you expand on why that
that's right. So the second step said that, okay, now the problem of systemic evil applies to not only theists, but also to atheists as well. So atheists have to take the problem of evil seriously as well. And then what is interesting here is that it seems that once all of them face the problem of evil, theists seem to be more advantaged than atheists, because theists can appeal to all kinds of supernaturalist resources. Because theists are, they typically believe that the universe was created by God, but there is something beyond the universe. First, God himself or herself is beyond the universe. And probably there is the afterlife as well. So their ontology is not limited to this specific material universe in which we currently exist. So their ontology is much broader than that. But atheists are typically naturalists. So they think that this material universe is all there is. There is nothing beyond that. When we die, that's the end of our existence. There is no such thing as God, as a supernatural being. So what they can appeal to when they try to solve the problem of systemic evil is something that exists within the material universe. Now suppose that atheists can somehow appeal to these naturalist resources to resolve the problem of systemic evil. But then theists can appeal to them as well, because theists' ontology includes atheist naturalist ontology. So whatever theists or naturalists can appeal to, theists can appeal to as well. Did I say theist? Whatever atheists or naturalists can appeal to, theists can appeal to as well. But on the other hand, suppose that theists can come up with a good solution to the problem of systemic evil, which appeals to something supernatural, like God or the afterlife or something like that. And then atheists or naturalists, they cannot borrow this response, because their ontology doesn't include anything supernatural. So when it comes to the problem of systemic evil, it looks like theists can either win or draw, while atheists can only draw or lose. So it looks like theists are more advantaged. So that's my third step.
Okay. Is there anything else as far as the basic picture focus? Because you do go into different perspectives on theistic accounts and non-theistic accounts. But as far as the atheistic account, is there another step in there you'd like to include?
There's no extra step. But one point that I want to emphasize is that, when I present this kind of idea, often people just read an abstract of my book, and then they will say, but there's no problem even for atheists, because there's no reason for them to embrace optimism. And then, I will say, that's absolutely right, and that's exactly what I say here. So if you're a pessimist, that's perfectly fine. I think an atheistic, naturalistic pessimism is perfectly consistent with systemic evil.
What you're addressing is atheism plus optimism, right?
Correct. Yeah. So the problem is that if atheist embraces the naturalistic ontology and optimism, then they face the problem, because it's quite difficult to maintain optimism without. When they maintain optimism, the problem of evil really appears intensely for them.
Okay, wonderful. Anything else you'd like to include by way of encapsulating your thesis before we move on to some counterpoints?
Let me think.
One thing you also mentioned in this book as well is you don't say this to refute atheism, right? It's
Right.
something that you basically say this is a challenge for wide swaths of use, right? So for listeners not to think that you're not attempting to refute atheism.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I'm not saying that therefore atheism is false. That's not the conclusion of my paper. So first, the big goal is to present the problem of systemic evil as a very powerful version of the problem of evil. Second goal is to show that this problem applies to not only theists, but for atheists as well. And then the third goal is to show that it looks like the problem of systemic evil is a more significant challenge for atheists than theists.
Okay, cool. So if you're comfortable with that encapsulation of your thesis, we can go into some counterpoints. Okay. So the first big counterpoint I would raise, going back to the distinction between evil and suffering, right? Because evil is a term of moral blame, right? Something that we can point at a moral agent, somebody who intended to cause an action, right? Where it does seem to me that if there is a creator God, then yes, you can point to the systemic. And you even mentioned that there's one sentence in there where you say somebody could look at the systemic problem of evil as an individual act of moral evil, but you don't expand on that. And I do want to expand on that here shortly, but I would contend that from the atheistic perspective, it's not clear to me that you can describe it in terms of evil, because there's not a someone to blame. If the world is mindless and godless, you would expect that world to be filled with pain. So it's not, from that perspective, that objection would be that it's not clear that the problem of evil even arises in the first case.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. So Michael Tooley, he introduced the distinction between the deontological problem of evil and the axiological problem of evil. The deontological problem, I think that's his terminology. The deontological problem of evil is about what God ought to do. So God created the world, but God ought to eliminate evil, or God ought not to create a world like this.
Mhm.
So according to this formulation of the problem of evil, God as a moral agent, uh, 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 he or believers of his existence would face a problem because there is evil in this world, and if God is morally perfect, then God ought not to create a world like this or allow evil. But my focus is on the other formulation of the problem of evil, the axiological problem of evil, which is the idea that the axiological level of the world is incompatible with the belief that God created the world. So here we are not blaming God for doing something or not doing something. We are blaming that the level of the world doesn't appear to be high enough, assuming that God created the world. So we are not saying to God, God, what are you doing? You should save these victims. So that's more like the deontological problem of evil. But axiological problem is more like, theists believe that God created the world, so their expectations should be this high. But given the existence of evil, the axiological level is lower than that. So that's a problem for theists. So we don't need an agent here. And that's why I want to formulate the problem of systemic evil in terms of axiological expectation mismatch, because there can be an axiological expectation mismatch even for axiarchists or pantheists or atheists. Because I think you're right that they don't believe in any agent who created the world or who can intervene. So
Yeah. So I guess we would both agree that subtracting the element of optimism, at least an atheist can consistently not deal with the problem of evil because there's no one to blame. There's no one to shake your fist at and say,
right,
created
exactly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Now moving to the optimism and the optimism side of it, this is another one that I would contend with, that in your book, it seems that there's a dichotomy that either you're an optimist or you're a pessimist, and I would present a third option of just not having a judgment, right? So, as you quote in your book, in the first chapter, the 31st verse of the book of Genesis, God looks at his creation and says that it is good. And if God exists, I mean, that's perfectly within his worldview, right? He's able to fathom the whole of creation, has the wisdom to judge it. Yet the atheist can say, well, I'm not in that position. I don't feel that I have any sort of epistemic obligation to make that, because I just can't fathom the world as it is, right? I can question my own wisdom. So, why can't the atheist just pick a third option of just not having a judgment? Just say the world is as it is, and I just happen to live in it without making a godlike proclamation of, I have this judgment that the world is either bad or good, and I'm going to superimpose this judgment onto the world as if the world was caring.
Right. Yeah, I like that, and I think you're right. So atheists could just say, I don't have any judgment about the axiological value of the world. I'm just an atheist. I don't believe that a good God created the world, so I don't have any background assumption to infer that the world is supposed to be good. And also, I'm not, psychologically speaking, I'm not particularly optimistic or pessimistic, and I don't have any specific view about how good the world is. And I think that's fine. If you are an atheist like that, you can avoid the problem of evil, because again, the problem arises only if you are an optimist, either theistic or atheistic.
Okay, wonderful. So we agree on that point. But in your book, you do mention that part of the reason you characterize atheists generally as optimists is because you allude to some empirical research that says most atheists happen to respond that way, and survey data, I'm assuming, is
there are a lot of empirical research which suggests that people are overall optimistic.
Sure.
They have optimist bias, which is, it seems to me that it's very uncontroversial among psychologists.
Sure.
And moreover, what's interesting for me is that they are not just optimist in general, but optimist with respect to what philosophers call evil. So people are optimist about the possibility that they can be affected by crimes, natural disasters, and all instances of evil. People tend to be optimistic.
So I do want to distinguish, however, that optimism is a term of art, as you mentioned in the book, that originates in the philosophy of religion, right? But I'm not quite sure that term, in terms of an axiological assessment of how the universe is, maps onto what people and social scientists mean when they talk about people
mm,
being
mm,
optimistic, right? Because
mm,
it seems to me coherent that, kind of taking a stoic approach of distinguishing between what one can control and what's beyond one's control. Well, one's
mm,
own psyche, one's own
mm,
thoughts, one's own
mm,
dispositions, one's own
mm,
choice to be
mm,
optimistic, to be grateful, is
mm,
within one's control. So it seems to me the atheist can say, yeah, I have an optimistic outlook. I choose to be grateful, because I think that's a good thing.
mm,
But that doesn't mean I have to assume that
mm,
the rest of the world coheres to that,
mm,
that the whole of the universe. Again, not choosing to make a universal judgment, but one
mm,
saying, okay, well, my mind is a small thing. I have a grasp of, right?
mm,
I can choose qualitatively to gear it in an optimistic direction without
mm,
saying that that's tied
mm,
to how the rest of creation
mm,
is.
mm. Yeah, I kind of agree with you. So many of these empirical studies, they are about optimism about personal issues
Mm.
like divorce or
Mm.
the chance that you can be uh, your possession can be stolen by someone, or that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, uh, yeah, so in that sense, their optimism seems to be concerned with personal issues, but also there are some studies on people's optimism about the natural disasters. So people have optimistic inclination to think that this whole town won't be affected by earthquakes anytime soon, or
Mm.
they think that there won't be any nuclear war in the near future. And people tend to have this broader version of optimism as well,
Mm. Okay.
which seems to be more relevant.
Sure. And
Mm,
one of the people you attribute this more general optimism to, as
mm,
you already have
mm,
alluded to, is Richard Dawkins.
mm,
However, I would contend that
mm,
the particular use of his quotes, um, in context of how he said them, one was a
mm,
debate, one was an extemporaneous speech he
mm,
was giving, he wasn't attempting, it's certainly not in writing,
mm,
to elaborate on this systematic worldview called existential optimism,
mm,
right? And he was very much, he and some of the other atheists you quote in his cohort use I statements. They talk about
mm,
themselves, right? So
mm,
he,
mm,
one of the quotes you use a few
mm,
times is when he's looking up at the stars, right?
mm,
So,
mm.
I
Yeah,
am filled with gratitude.
yeah.
And you, in your book,
Mm,
you say it would be a charitable interpretation to say that they're not just talking about themselves as,
mm,
an exalted lucky
mm,
few,
mm,
but I'm not sure if that's actually a
mm,
charitable
mm,
view,
mm,
because it seems to me that what you're doing is you're taking these specific extemporaneous quotes about themselves
mm,
and using them to hold them to a worldview
mm,
that, according to how you use it,
mm,
sort of is being imposed on others, that we should be grateful for our existence, right? That
mhm,
we
mhm,
have
mhm.
cause to
Yeah.
be grateful. Yet, given the fairly narrow and specific, use of
Mm,
I looking up at the stars,
right.
it's not clear to me if that's actually charitable to
Uh-huh.
take a statement about his own psychology in those
Uh-huh.
moments
Uh-huh.
and say that makes it so that he's committed to a worldview we should hold.
Uh-huh. But doesn't he also say something like, we are a very lucky existence, and it's probabilistically speaking, it's
Mhm.
very unlikely that we
Sure.
could have come into existence,
Mhm.
and we should be grateful that we can appreciate this beauty of the Milky Way and Grand Canyon and amazing features of this world.
Yes, yes, he's
Yeah.
definitely big on pointing out
Mm,
the probabilistic luck that we came into being in the first place.
right.
However, and this is something I want to get to more shortly, but
Mm,
the difference in the term "should"
mm,
when coming from an atheist versus
mm,
when coming from a theist
uh-huh.
is very different, right?
So would you say that he's saying something like, I'm one of those privileged people in a wealthy country with a good job who can drink a glass of wine and enjoy the beauty of the stars? They think he implies that kind of thing rather than making a bigger claim, like our whole humanity should be grateful for our
So I had
existence.
two responses.
Mm,
Unfortunately, they both are not
mm,
very friendly interpretations to
mm,
him. But
mm,
one is, as I've heard you describe in other
mm,
interviews, he's not a philosopher. He wasn't attempting to be
right.
systematic.
Yeah.
So I think in some ways, I do give him slack in that I think it was sort of an off-the-cuff remark, right? The main one you focus on is in the context of a debate where he's kind of giving a poetic or romantic
Right.
interpretation
Yeah,
of the facts of science,
yeah.
what he calls the poetry of nature, the poetry of reality.
Yeah.
And to that extent, I don't think he was attempting to be systematic, or certainly not like in a philosophic sense attempting to make a strong claim there. The second response I would give is I think he would make that claim, right? Because he's been accused, of being an ivory tower intellectual.
Right.
The response is, well, I like the ivory tower.
Yeah.
So I think in some case he may say things to the effect that generalize to others, sure. But it's not clear to me he's a great example of an expositor or a proselytizer on behalf of existential optimism. I don't think he meant it that deeply, and I don't think he meant that forcefully to project to others.
Because another quote from Dawkins that I have in the book is that where he says, natural selection is a horrific process, and we wouldn't want to live in a world like this.
Yep.
And I think he's right that if our social and political system was based on natural selection, it would be horrible.
Sure.
Sick people and people with disability, and so they cannot survive because it's a very cruel, violent system. And of course, we wouldn't want to live in that kind of society. So he makes that kind of claim as well. Which is, I'm very sympathetic with. But then I really want to know what he wants to say when he has this romantic view of our existence and the universe.
Yeah.
If he's, if he says directly, the nature is quite horrific, and it's not necessarily a good thing for us to exist. And if he embraces pessimism, then I would say, yeah, that's fine. But if he wants to be, on the one hand, he agrees that natural selection is a horrific system which guarantees pain and suffering. But on the other hand, he has this romantic view of our existence.
Yes.
And that's I think that's a good illustration of how the problem of evil might arise for atheists.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think the element he would add here is that, yes, we don't want a system based purely on Darwinian natural selection. The saving grace, and I use that term sort of ironically in his case, he's an atheist, but is that we're a rational creature, right? We have this faculty about our cognition that is able to make us not merely bound to our, lowly animalistic nature, but have something that can push us out of that, something that can create a society more moral than is endowed by nature. But again, I wouldn't want to speak for him on that account. But I think again, it's not clear to me that
that's an interesting response, because I always say that's a kind of a naturalistic theodicy. So it's almost like a greater good theodicy.
Okay, interesting.
So the world is quite horrible. Natural selection and evolution are violent and unfair process, but we can use our creativity to improve our world.
Sure.
So we can improve the axiological level of the world, and I will say that that's a kind of a theodicy which doesn't appeal to anything supernatural.
But it's interesting because I think there might be a way which that what you're describing as a naturalistic theology could also be consistent with Christianity in some ways, right? Because the term logos, right, which is the same etymological root as our term for logic, right, which I think Dawkins would really enjoy, is also the term, for example, in the the Gospel of John. It begins in the beginning was the term used is logos, but we in English say the word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and through the Word all things came to be, and without it nothing came to be, right? So in some sense there is a Christian view of the logos being both a revelatory but also a creative element, right? Because in some sense, right, God spake the world into existence, right? But then he also judged the world, right? So there's a creative element, but also a qualitative assessment or a revelatory element that I think is consistent. So that's an interesting kind of fusion of what you described as a possible naturalistic theodicy, but it also could be a Christian theodicy in some sense, that God endowed us with reason to get us out of our lowly animalistic nature.
Right. For me, that's interesting from an opposite perspective, because theists typically, as I mentioned earlier, theists develop theodicies, and atheists, like Dawkins and some other people, will say, of course, these theodicies are useless. That's what they typically would say. But when I present the problem of systemic evil, they try to come up with this kind of naturalistic theodicy to resolve the problem. And their reasoning is almost like theists' reasoning.
How so?
Like what you just presented was like a greater good theodicy. The world is not that great, but we can improve the world. Maybe we can realize greater goods by working together, and this kind of idea.
Sure.
Yeah.
So another thing too. So moving on from where I hesitate to accept that atheists have any obligation to accept optimism, I would say that it's perfectly fair to either accept pessimism or this kind of non-judgmentalism about the world.
Yeah. But, so that's I think that's an important point. Yeah, because people seem to overlook. So if you're a pessimist, if you agree that the world is overall and fundamentally not good, that's fine.
Okay.
And as you mentioned, if you don't have any judgment about how good the world should be, then that's fine as well.
Okay.
But I think I want to know what you think.
Sure.
But what do you think typical atheists believe? Do you think? I think my assumption is that it seems to me that many or most atheists, they are some kind of optimists, and they think that the overall the world is not that bad. I mean, there are some unfortunate people who have unfortunate situations, but nevertheless, overall and also fundamentally, the world is not that bad.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think this is a guess, but I would assume most atheists would make a similar distinction that I made about one's own optimism about their psychology versus, a more vast axiological assessment of the world, right? That to me, again, that seems like a much higher bar than saying, well, I'm just going to choose.
But do you think people would prefer to, for example, procreate if they believe that the world is overall and fundamentally bad?
Well, that's interesting because in some sense, I think a really hardcore atheist that is, motivated by evolution would say, well, actually, the only purpose to our existence is to procreate, right? Because they say from a biological perspective, that is the imperative, right? To pass on one's genes. So even if they accept that the world is bad, they might still, that flavor of atheist might still say, well, I'm still going to procreate anyways. That's my purpose.
Is that because they're not reflective enough, or?
Yeah, I don't know.
So here's an analogy, bad analogy, but it might illustrate my point. So let's say we live in a really horrible society. There's a dictator, and political and social system is really, really bad. And the question is, in this kind of society where people are constantly killed and harmed, how would you want to raise children?
Yeah, well,
that's
so
kind
if
of
the
analogous here. Yeah.
Sorry?
That's kind of an analogous here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if the analogy is the world faces the problem of evil, and in your analogy, the society faces evil, I think from their perspective, I mean, if you ask them specifically, why did you have a kid, given that society is bad, they say, well, it's a good thing, right? I love my spouse. I want, the purpose, the feeling, the satisfaction of, nurturing and growing someone into like a fully mature person. I think, so in other words, they would still couch what they might view on the macro level as a bad thing in a micro level in terms of their household as a good thing. So I think both are consistent. You can say, yeah, this kid is going to struggle politically, but I mean, is it going to bring my life full of joy and meaning and purpose and something to work for, something to bond with the spouse over, etc.
Yeah, so this analogy is not a good one because in the case of this political social situation, you could improve it. But in the case of nature, you cannot change the whole system because it's a nomological necessity. It's not as if we can change the process of evolution or natural selection.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, but I do want to get back to the idea of the difference in how strong a term the word should is, right? So if we
Mhm.
accept that the atheist plus optimist
Mhm.
says, yes, you should be grateful to the world,
Mhm.
and the theist also says that, it's very different. The term should is very, very strong coming from the theist, particularly.
I don't say they should be grateful to the world. I don't talk about gratitude here. I mean, they could be grateful for their existence, but it's not as if they express gratitude towards the world, as if the world is an agent.
So, do you mind re-explaining to me then the emotive element of the
Oh yeah,
axiological?
maybe it's about that's about the gratitude towards their existence. It's not like saying, "Oh, thank you, the world, for allowing me to be
Okay.
existent."
Not 100% clear to me what the distinction is, right? Because I mean, the object of what's
Mm.
receiving the gratitude may be different, but
Yeah,
that,
because as you mentioned earlier, if you're an atheist, you don't believe that there is some kind of
yes,
agent
there's no
beyond
someone to
our
thank.
right. Yeah, yeah. So we are not saying thank you, world, for allowing me to be existent. It's not like that.
Okay.
So the gratitude is that I'm grateful to be alive.
Grateful to whom though? To what though? Because so
I
I think
mean,
it's one.
grateful uh, about the existence. Can't I be grateful that something happens without thanking anyone specifically?
You can definitely appreciate things without attributing your appreciation
Mm-hmm.
causally to something,
Mm-hmm.
but gratitude, I'm not sure if I can construe it without there being an agent responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there could be. Perhaps there could be.
Because certainly I don't want to assume any agent here. So the idea, this emotive aspect of optimism is that I'm happy to be alive, or I'm grateful that I have I live in this world, and this kind of idea. I mean, if you think that the gratitude requires an agent to be direct it to, then yeah, I shouldn't be talking about gratitude.
Okay, but but I do.
I can if I survive a airplane crash,
Mhm.
I can be grateful that I have survived.
Yes, you're not grateful for the
It's
crash. You're
not.
grateful.
Yeah, I'm
Yes,
not
yeah,
saying thank you.
right.
Thank you.
Airplane
Yeah,
for crashing.
airplane. Yeah.
Sure, sure, sure. But well, okay, but so I, because I do recall reading
Mm,
that some of how you
mm,
encapsulated existential optimism
mm,
included that that the world is at least not bad,
mhm.
and I do recall some should grateful phrase. Can you rephrase how would you phrase it? I don't want to hold you to a view
Yeah,
that you don't
probably.
have because you don't have it, but
I have to read this chapter again.
okay.
What did I say? Can you tell me your interpretation of what I said in that chapter?
Well, basically, so
Mm,
taking Dawkins' own view of, I'm grateful to exist in the world, to say
mhm.
we should be grateful because of the
Right,
unprobabilistic nature of our own existence in the first place,
right,
that there's something to be grateful for,
right,
right? Maybe
right,
maybe we're not thinking the world,
right.
but that we should
Yeah,
be grateful.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah.
that's all
Right.
that matters, right?
Yeah.
And so something similar would apply, but again, the asymmetry I'm trying to point out here is it's much different coming from a theist, particularly theists of an Abrahamic
Mm-hmm.
worldview. Which I mean, so I know you are not a sectarian or Christian philosopher,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, much of the work you borrow from
Mm-hmm.
comes from the fruit of
Yeah,
Christian
yeah.
thinkers, including literal Catholic saints. And when they were talking about God,
Mm-hmm.
they were talking about a lawgiver God, and they were talking about a God that, if you disobey, can
Mm-hmm.
ultimately send you to hell. Right
Mm-hmm.
now, a Christian may disagree with the idea that He sent you to hell. Some of
Mm-hmm.
your choices have gone to hell by the misuse of your own free will.
Mm-hmm.
But the point remains that the sort of God, particularly a biblical God, that will strike down disobedient people, will have plagues visit whole groups of people if they're bad enough. I mean, that should, right, you should be grateful. And you quote some theistic philosophers, including, for example, Richard Swinburne, who
Mm-hmm.
says not only that we should,
Mm-hmm.
but that it is obligatory
Right,
that man be grateful, that man
right,
worship his
right.
God, right?
Yeah.
And so in that case, it seems to me, again, this should, if we accept the
Mm-hmm.
the optimism angle, is still much stronger
Mm-hmm.
coming from a theist than coming from
Mm-hmm.
an atheist.
Yeah, it's kind of related to our earlier discussion about the distinction between the ontological problem of evil and the axiological problem of evil.
Hmm.
So if we focus on theism, okay, there is this agent called God who created the world and who could, it seems, to eliminate evil in the world. And then, for this agent, we can say, thank you for creating the world, or why are you not eliminating evil in this world? We can blame God. But again, and in that sense, the problem of evil, or this the gratitude that the theists express, can be clearly presented by referring to God as an agent. But I think, if I remember correctly, what I wanted to present in that part of the book was that, okay, there is an emotive formulation of the problem of systemic evil. So it's not necessarily about the propositional inconsistency between the belief that there is this level of evil, this axiological level of reality, and our expectation which doesn't match. It's more about our emotive reaction to the existence of pain and suffering in the world. How come there is how can we maintain optimism if the world is like this? So again, I don't think I was necessarily talking about some kind of agent, because I never think that atheists can assume this kind of agent that would replace God in their atheistic naturalistic ontology.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, the point I was trying to make more so is that if someone were to accept this existential optimism and made that claim, it carries much different weight and much more weight coming from particularly the Abrahamic faith, right?
Is it more or a different weight?
I think it's much stronger, because it's not just, so the atheist optimist is free to say, well, yes, you should be grateful because it's good for you, because just psychologically you will be a more grateful person. You'll be you'll be able to see the silver lining of things more. Whereas the theist would say, well, if you're not grateful, if you're ungrateful to God, I mean, that is a sinful sort of thing, right?
But here I want to set aside God as an agent as well. Okay, I talk about worship worthiness, which might have been a little bit confusing, but here I want to present the same problem to theists and atheists, and they both would have this kind of emotive reaction. They want to be grateful for their own existence in this world, but at the same time, their observation doesn't, the axiological observation doesn't match their emotive reaction to the world. So I want to kind of set aside this God who should be thanked by us.
Interesting. Okay, that so that's an interesting move, and it's consistent. But at least from having read your book, it wasn't obvious to me that that was the expectation that you had writing it, right? Particularly given that I think most Christians that read your book, that is the God they're thinking of. They're thinking of the God that, before eating food or before bed, you thank, right?
Yeah.
It's a very specific someone to thank, right? Any
Yeah.
good things that happen,
Right.
any morally bad things one does and one feels guilty about, one should apologize to God, right? So that's interesting. So the view you espouse, yes, it doesn't require the agent to thank, but in practice, I think very few people wouldn't assume.
Yeah, in practice, that's right. And also, going back to the deontological problem of evil, it's right that they do have this agent whom they could blame. But I want to set that aside, because I want to present the same problem to theists and atheists. And I say there's a similar emotive reaction to their own existence in the world.
Okay, interesting. Okay, yeah.
So I mean, you're right that the theists, they worship God and they're thankful to God almost every day because God created the world and us. But I kind of want to set that aside, and I want to say that both theists and atheists, they have this axiological expectation mismatch, or an emotive version of this problem, where their reaction doesn't really coincides with their observation of the world.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's interesting. And so another thing I want to get into is the possibility of an evil or sadistic creator, right? Because this to me seems that it really, if we go into this idea, recontextualize the problem of evil, right? Because especially as you mentioned earlier, the logical problem of evil, maybe it doesn't work as an objection, but that we have an all-powerful and wholly good God creating a creation that's painful. There's a tension there. Maybe you don't want to say it's a logical contradiction outright, but there is something that has to be squared there. Whereas if we remove the holy good element, just say that God in some kind of bare bones metaphysical ontological sense is the prime mover, is the ground of being, is the source of being, and as such is all powerful and all knowing, then it's like, okay, then yes, it's consistent that an all knowing, all powerful, but not necessarily all good, maybe amoral or maybe even an evil God would create a creation filled with evil. And that's, I think, perfectly logically consistent.
That's very interesting. So my first response would be this. So probably people who believe in the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and somewhat evil being, that's, they don't really face the problem of systemic evil. It appears so initially, but then there might be a different kind of axiological expectation mismatch. So the question is how evil this being is meant to be. So you might think that, okay, this world is pretty bad, but if you believe that this evil being is really, really evil, you might think that actually this world is not as evil, as bad as it could be. So there is a gap between your expectation and reality. So the evilness of your evil God has to be perfectly in line with the level of badness of the world that you would observe.
Yes.
So just merely assuming that there is an evil God, you're not avoiding a form of axiological expectationism.
I'm curious about that because it seems so. Accepting your account of the systematic problem of evil, right? There's no human individual or group of sadistic psychopaths that could do anything like the damage that huge natural disasters do, that evolution, as you mentioned, does, right? In fact, it's reflected in our own language that if a disaster is horrible enough, we say it's of biblical proportions, right? If enough people are so badly harmed, we think the only agent responsible for this could be God, right? So on some level, yes, there you don't necessarily go into at least this view that I'm proposing as an alternative doesn't have to calibrate exactly how evil God is, but given the nature, sort of working in reverse, right? Saying, okay, let's assume there's an all-powerful, all-knowing creator. Let's look at his creation and say, well, from his creation, from this fruit, we will know the tree, right? In this case, we have a world that's filled with pain and evil. So, kind of working our way backwards, what sort of creator would have done that, right? It's also, to me, relevant that if we have an all-powerful, all-knowing creator, his creation would go according to plan. Right. It seems most logical that it would go according to plan, and he would like what he sees.
But does it matter how evil this being is? So there is the best possible being in a moral sense. So God is meant to be all good, and then there's the most evil being, and there are many different possible beings in between. So there are some very, very good but not perfectly good being, and reasonably good being, bad being, very bad being, and evil being. Now this world, let's assume that this world is reasonably bad. But then there seems to be evidence against the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, really evil being, because the world is not bad enough.
Sure. So I wouldn't make any commitments to the level of badness, right? The degree, right? Whereas the theists would, right? So they would say God is all good, or in your terminology, maximally good. But I guess the main point I'm trying to make is not arguing for this claim, but given how systematic, broad, and deep your book is, this possibility was only given one sentence worth of mention in there.
That's probably because no one really defends explicitly that kind of idea. And also the way you present says that we can kind of adjust the level of badness of this being in light of our observation of the world. It's almost like an ad hoc response to my argument.
Okay, expand on that.
So, if there is someone, I can imagine someone who believe that this world was created by the most horrendous spirit or something. And then I would say, okay, for them there is an axiological expectation mismatch because this world is not that bad.
Sure.
But then I thought that your response was to say, oh, but you're not really embracing that kind of the worst, most evil being. We can just flexibly think about the level of evilness of this being in question by looking at the level of badness of the world.
Sure.
But isn't that almost like an ad hoc response? So you're kind of formulating a view that no one defends, which is consistent with my argument. And I would say you're right if they're, that kind of view is consistent with the existence of systemic evil, because you created a view that is in fact consistent.
Okay,
but it's not that interesting because no one really seriously defends that kind of view.
Okay.
Yeah. So in a way, I'm agreeing with you, but I'm saying that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm choosing to take that actually as a compliment, because now I'm thinking this might be some kind of novel perspective if nobody else defends it, but not a particularly interesting one. Anyways, I guess the main reason it's worth spelling out why to entertain this idea in the first place, right? Because if we assume there is a wholly good God, right, given the nature of evil, right, we have to assume that either some theodicy wins out in the end, or God is, just looking on at the preventable suffering in the world, and sad and somehow impotent to do anything about it, right? Which that raises a problem for the the traditional perfect being theology of an all good, all powerful, all knowing being, right? Something goes awry, or you have a God, that's seeing all things, right? It's omnipresent, omniscient, right? Knowing all the things that are going on and likes what he sees, right? To me, so I mean, the issue of the gradient of how evil that is, I mean, that's something I haven't thought through. But in terms of what would be an alternative, given that if you assume the world had to have had a first cause, right? That, the universe began to exist, and the cause of existence is God. That's one of the traditional attributes of God, that he's a creator of the universe. If such a being were to exist, what sort of quality would that, what sort of characteristic would that being have? It seems to me there's a logical problem that arises if we assume it's good, where it's not as problematic if it's bad, or somehow amoral. Maybe it doesn't care about our suffering, right? And I think that may solve some of the issue that you're raising with the degree of badness, right? If it's just a non-caring, if it just sees us as dominoes to be set up, not really cared about, if it's some sort of deistic thing that puts things into motion but doesn't stick around and watch, that would be another alternative as well. But it's not necessarily an evil thing, but it's just apathetic to us.
Yeah, the deistic option is quite interesting. So if there is an all-powerful, all-knowing being who created the universe, but this being doesn't intervene at all. But then I wonder, do you think the problem of systemic evil would still arise? Because obviously this being created the system. It's not as if we created the system. So in that sense, it's different from wars and crimes.
Again, it's not clear to me if it would apply if we assume it's apathetic, right? If it's just a watchmaker that doesn't care what its watch goes through, it's not clear to me there's a problem of evil, because what sort of expectation, assuming that it's just an apathetic, deadbeat creator, father type figure. I mean,
right. So this being is not good or bad or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to me one option that would be both consistent with not facing the problem of evil, but having some kind of God, some kind of creator God.
Right. So as an alternative to traditional theism, proponents of these views don't face the problem of evil for theists.
Yes.
But again, the question is whether they are optimists. Do they still embrace some kind of optimism? So, they'll be in the same circle as atheists here. So if they embrace deism and optimism, they still face the problem of systemic evil.
Another issue I wanted to mention, as an asymmetry in the problem of evil
mm,
is the existence or non-existence of an afterlife. And this is another
mm,
one that
mm,
you're very summary in
mm,
your book. You
mm.
only make one mention
Yeah,
of the possibility of an afterlife in
yeah.
the section where you're talking about the supernatural resources theists have to
Mm,
combat, or
mm,
the theodicies they have available to them.
mm,
But
mm,
it's not clear to me that that is just in the favor of the theists, because I
mm,
think it could make the problem of evil that
mm,
much
mm,
worse
mm,
for the theists, right?
mm.
Given hell, right?
Yeah.
The existence, if hell exists as a form of eternal punishment,
Mm,
right, that makes the scope, the
mm,
longevity of
mm,
suffering
mm,
much
mm,
worse.
mm,
Whereas on the atheistic account, if we assume that death is basically synonymous with just annihilation,
mm,
actually that's a much more merciful
mm,
way to go, right? Where in the
mm,
case where death acts as a general anesthetic
mm.
for the atheist, whereas it could be eternal damnation, being
Right.
in the company of and sharing the same punishment as people like Hitler,
Mm,
right? I mean that raises problems of justice as
right.
well. But I mean, how would you respond to the idea that hell makes the problem of evil worse?
Yeah, so there can be a form of the problem of evil in hell for theists.
Mm-hmm.
So as you say, if many or even most people have to suffer in hell eternally, this is a intense form of uh, evil. It appears. So theists would have to address that, and atheists, on the other hand, they don't need to worry about that because atheists don't believe in the afterlife. So I think it's quite important to consider what kind of afterlife we have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I have a paper titled "Protheism," sorry, "Pro Immortalism and Pro Mortalism," I think,
Mm-hmm.
where I argue that we cannot just say generally if we want to be mortal or immortal, because if we sometimes people say, do you want to live forever, or do you want to exist forever?
Mm-hmm.
And people have some intuitive answers to that, this kind of question. But my point is that you have to specify exactly what kind of afterlife or
Sure.
immortality you have. There can be a really horrific
Yes.
form of immortality, like
Mm-hmm.
eternally punished.
Yes. And it seems to me, I mean, this is my
Yeah,
own judgment, but it seems to
yeah,
me there are many worse options for permanence than there are for impermanence. Right?
right.
I can't think of anything I would want to do
Uh-huh.
for forever. Right? I
Yeah,
mean, it would be exhausting on the one hand, but also boring.
yeah,
Right? And I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
not to trivialize the idea of
Mm-hmm.
heaven, but
Mm-hmm.
many theists would say that heaven is ultimately a union and adoration of God.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't want to be in church forever,
Right,
right? And
right.
that to me doesn't seem like
Yeah,
a great option
yeah,
either,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And questions arise too. Well,
yeah,
do beings in heaven have free will?
yeah.
Well, how do they stay in heaven? Do we become some kind of automata in
Mm-hmm.
heaven? So it seems to me that this is another thing where if the balance of how theists and
Mm-hmm.
atheists have to address it, it
Mm-hmm.
still seems to me this makes the problem worse for the theists, or
I mean, the
potentially worse.
problem gets worse for theists if they have to assume that there is a really horrific form of
Mm.
afterlife. If theists must accept this kind of view, then you can say, all right, so theists, they have supernatural resources such as the afterlife, but by appealing to that, their position gets worse
Mm.
because there's more pain and suffering in the afterlife
Mm.
beyond the material universe.
Mm.
But they're not. I don't think they must accept this specific form of the afterlife. There can be many other better forms of the afterlife. But
Sure.
again, my point is that I'm not proposing any new solution to the problem of systemic
Mm.
evil. I'm just almost on purpose. I just very briefly mentioned these possible options because I
Yes.
don't want to say theists, you're in a better position because you can appeal to this specific view of the afterlife or a specific view of something beyond the material universe.
Mhm.
My point is that theists might not be able to resolve the problem by appealing to supernaturalist resources, but their position is not as bad as atheists' position.
Mhm.
because at least they can appeal to something more than atheists.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so I definitely don't want to depict you as defending these theodicies as if
Mm.
they work.
Mm.
But one of the ones you've mentioned it here as well, is the skeptical theism theodicy,
Mm.
which is often presented, to put it very simplistically, very
Mm.
bluntly, as given a broader context, things are better than they look. Right. In the end, God has some kind of morally sufficient reason to allow our suffering, but ultimately we'll kind of be let in on the laugh.
Right.
I mean, this is arguing a very particular perspective of what we don't know, which
Right.
is sort of, I mean, it kind of sounds a bit like a God of the gaps. I mean, that we're
Right.
assuming, and the God that's being filled is a good God, right? But if we can argue one way without knowing that we're too limited to know, but things actually look better than they do given a broader perspective, why can't you go the opposite way and say, well, things might actually look worse than they seem given a broader perspective, right? Maybe God is involved in actually cheering on the suffering, and maybe the suffering is the point. I know you want to avoid too much theological scriptural stuff, but I mean, consistent throughout the Bible is suffering characteristics of the people that he chooses, whether it's Job or Moses and the Israelites wandering in the desert, or Jesus Christ himself, right, being tortured to death. I mean, it seems that all along the way, suffering is the point.
That's interesting because, I mean, if we compare theism and atheism here, for me, theism seems to be in a better position because theists believe that there is a good God. So whatever reason God has, that must be good and justified. And I often wonder whether atheists can mimic theistic responses to the problem of evil once they face the problem of systemic evil. But here, when atheists try to mimic skeptical theism, they cannot appeal to anything like a good God. So they cannot say, whatever the reason, there must be some good reason. Because they don't believe in the existence of a good God. So for me, atheists are more disadvantaged here than theists.
Okay, yeah, and that is obviously the thrust of your book. But I would say another thing that I don't think, from what I recall, you don't mention this in the objections either. But one thing that immediately struck me is that I think the atheists can preemptively say they anticipated the idea that the theist is better situated to answer these questions, going back to Freud, identifying that the wish fulfillment element of religious belief, that, to put it very crudely, is like, yeah, of course it feels better to believe in God. That's a feature rather than a bug of religious belief, that it feels better.
But it's not just about psychological feeling, optimistic feeling that you get, because metaphysically speaking, they have a broader picture. So whether or not their view is correct, there is something beyond the material universe which they can appeal to. You can say that you might think that this metaphysical view itself is false, but it's not just as if they embrace theism because it feels better.
Yeah, so, and I understand that point, but again, it would I would resort back to the objection I made to skeptical theism, that yes, they may have more resources that help solve the problem, but by the same token, couldn't we say that, well, maybe things actually get worse with more resources, that maybe there is no heaven and all there is just a hell afterwards, right? It's like, I can imagine quite a lot, right? And so the theist can imagine quite a lot that's consistent with a good God. But unless compelling reason is given to say that this actually exists, it's not. It doesn't seem to be. The atheist would say it's not a strong solution.
So I would say, okay, naturalists or atheists, their view is quite specific. There is nothing beyond the material universe, so that's fixed. Theists believe that there is something beyond the material universe, but there can be all sorts of supernaturalism. And you're right that if you accept a bad kind of supernaturalism, the problem can get worse. So you have to have the right kind of supernaturalism to respond to the problem of systemic evil, assuming that there is a supernaturalist response. But that doesn't make theist position in general worse than atheist position. Because again, if atheists can come up with a good response, probably theists can appeal to that as well. And then whatever theists can appeal to, atheists cannot. There can be a problem only in a situation where theists can appeal to a supernaturalistic response, which would just amplify the problem of evil.
Okay. Yeah. And so that one of the points you make in the book is that whatever response the atheist has is also available to the theist, right? As you say, they either win or draw. But again, if we're going back to the contention that if there's no agent to blame, that seems to me an option available to the. And obviously, what you said earlier is you're not considering that agent. But how common do you think the view of God not as an agent actually is in these sorts of
Oh, I'm not
theodicies?
saying that the God is not an agent. I am saying
Sure.
that God is an agent.
But given the gratitude, the element of who you're pointing the gratitude at.
Oh, I see. You're talking about gratitude. Yeah. So when I talked about the distinction between the deontological problem of evil and the axiological problem of evil, I say, there are these two versions of the problem. But I want to set aside the deontological problem, which is which basically blames God for creating this world or allowing evil. So I'm talking about this axiological level of the world and the mismatch that arises when we encounter evil.
I guess the common thread for me in both the title of evil and gratitude is that these are terms to me that seem that they're pointing at a someone, right? And
that's something that I would want to dispute, because the way I formulate the problem of evil is purely about our expectation and observation, and this gap that exists in terms of the axiological level.
Yeah. So that seems to me very consistent. But again, it's not clear to me how many. I mean, and by the way, have you encountered this with theistic believers that I imagine some of them may raise this issue that the sort of God you're talking about obviously is an abstract philosopher's God. But I mean, I think a lot of people will read that thinking about their God that they go to church on Sundays to worship.
Yeah, but again, I'm not saying that God is not an agent. I'm just saying that when I formulate the problem of evil, I'm not formulating it in terms of God as an agent to blame or to be thankful.
Sure, it's about our own expectations, not aligning
So assuming
with
that there is this agent who created this world, the level of this world should be this high, but actually it doesn't seem to be that high. And this is the problem of axiological expectation mismatch. So the theists can have maintained God as an agent. That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's clear to me now. Yeah. That the contention, the main contention you make is about our expectations rather than about any sort of blameworthiness.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So there is a formulation of the problem in terms of blameworthiness, but my formulation is different. So I'm not excluding this formulation.
Interesting. Okay. And so would you say that it would be this view, somebody like a Christian would be able to adopt it easily just because it's about expectations, and so the agency of God really doesn't impinge as much on this question as other versions of it do? Or, I mean, it seems non-sectarian, obviously. So anyone that just believes in God, or just in terms of expectations, believe that the world is not bad, would be able to accept it.
I'm not sure if I understood your question.
Okay, I might have phrased it badly. It's just, to me, I guess a difference in our perspectives here is that the centrality of God, I think, is what most people bring to the table when they're talking about the problem of evil. But this almost sets that aside, instead talks about our expectations primarily.
But for theists, God is still there. We have this high expectation of reality. I mean, theists believe that their expectation of reality is pretty high because God, as an agent, created the world. So God as an agent is not completely go away from my picture. It's in the background. They have this high axiological expectation precisely because they believe in the existence of God as an agent who created the world. But when I present my problem of systemic evil, I kind of set aside this agent a bit, and I just focus on atheists and theists, axiological expectation mismatch.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and I will apologize because I didn't get to read the very last chapter of the book. I'm sorry. I finished this book, most of it this week. So, like this morning, I was still reading it, by the way. But the one thing that also came to mind was the Buddhist perspective, right? I mean, this is a worldview that is some versions of it in particular are really atheistic, and yet the problem of suffering, I mean, maybe this is different from the problem of evil, I would say, but is central to the goal, to the philosophy behind it. So, how, in your perspective, what role does the Buddhist perspective play in?
Yeah, so I wrote this chapter because I was quite interested in Eastern perspectives. So you might think, okay, maybe there is a version of the problem of evil for atheists in the West, but the people in the East who are, who don't have this traditional theistic background, for them this problem is completely irrelevant. But if you look at some texts in the East, there are some ideas that are very similar to the problem of evil. So the existence of pain and suffering in natural disasters and other horrific events, they raise existential concerns for them as well, and they get puzzled why the world is like this. And I thought this was a good illustration of how the problem of evil can arise for almost everyone, even people in the Eastern tradition. And in that chapter, I focus on the concept of impermanence, because Buddhists talk about different types of suffering. There is a suffering of suffering, which is about pain and suffering. Probably this is more similar to evil in the Western sense. But they also talk about the suffering of conditioned existence and the suffering of impermanence as well. So in the chapter, I focus on the suffering of impermanence. So when people encounter natural disasters, they certainly realize that everything is impermanent. People can suddenly die, or the whole town can be destroyed instantly. And again, there seems to be an axiological expectation mismatch here, because on the one hand, people naively assume that things will go on continuously, but suddenly they realize that everything is impermanent. And impermanence, according to Buddhism, is the foundation of reality. It's not something that you can avoid. So there are some pragmatic ways to avoid the suffering of impermanence. So, for example, some hermits, they try to isolate themselves and stay away from civilization because they think that we suffer a lot because we are surrounded by people and busy. They live in busy cities. So if you isolate yourself, you can be free from suffering. But even that's not an ultimate solution to the problem of suffering, because even hermits, they will die eventually. They cannot avoid illness and death and those things. Again, what I say there again is that there can be only, if there is a solution to the problem of suffering here at all, then the only solution that is potentially successful has to appeal to supernaturalism. Because if impermanence is the foundation of reality, we cannot avoid it without transcending our current existence.
And again, I apologize, I haven't read the chapter because I would like to respond in detail to how you respond to it. But just my initial sense is that because the Buddhists are it's the first of the Four Noble Truths, right? So it seems to be, if you kind of take that on in your metaphysical worldview as the first thing to know, and given the reality of suffering in the world, there's not a mismatch. The expectation going into it aligns with the reality going into it. How would you respond to that?
Right, that's good, because the expectation mismatch here is different from the expectation mismatch for Judeo-Christian theists, because I say Judeo-Christian theists faces the problem of the expectation mismatch because they have a high expectation of reality. The world was created by God, therefore the world should be pretty good, but there is evil. But the Buddhism says that life necessarily involves pain and suffering. So our expectation is that we suffer.
Yes.
So in a way, it matches our observation. Yes. When there are horrific events, it really confirms that yes. pain and suffering are unavoidable. So the expectation mismatch here is slightly different because the expectation that you get from this religious teaching is lower than our naive. The observation that we have by looking at horrific events is in line with the teaching yes. Of Buddhism. Mm-hmm. But the people tend to have a naive, higher expectation here. So these people who suffer, ordinary people, they are shocked. They wouldn't say, this is expected, this is what we are normally taught. Mm-hmm. They would say, how could this happen? How come the world is like this? Mm-hmm. So the expectation here is the expectation based on religious teaching is lower than the observation that we have. The axiological level of the expectation is lower than the actual observation.
Okay. Yeah. And so, I mean, would you agree then that this is another flavor? So we talked earlier about the pessimistic atheist, the non-judgmental atheist. Would you agree this is a third flavor of atheism that does not face the problem?
No, they do face the problem.
Okay.
I mean, if you are, let's say, pessimistic Buddhist, you don't face the problem. But if you live in this Buddhist culture where you get shocked by those horrific events, then you face the axiological expectation problem. And I would say this is a problem of systemic evil as well, even though you might want to avoid the term evil. This is a systemic problem because if Buddhism is right, if Buddhist metaphysics is right, then everything is impermanent, and that's a fundamental of metaphysical Buddhist metaphysics.
Yes, but wouldn't that fundamental aspect of the Buddhist metaphysic be in line with the reality? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So where's the mismatch?
Mismatch is our naive expectation that things will go on. So these medieval Japanese thinkers, they talk about how people naively assume that everything will go on without any problems. So you can find a lot of poetry, poems, and artistic works that describe the impermanence of everything. So it's a different kind of mismatch, but it is still a mismatch. If you accept Buddhism and then you say, yes, we should assume that life is full of pain and suffering, then yeah, you're right, there is no mismatch.
Okay. Yeah, I guess another kind of fundamental issue that comes to mind is the order in which we come to axiological expectations on the one hand, and then are encountered with the reality of the world, and which mismatches on the other hand, right? So it's like, which came first? I mean, practically, babies experience suffering and have disappointments and have these things before they're ever thinking in metaphysical terms. And yet, anybody born now is born after the Buddha would have laid down the Noble Truths, right? So it's theoretically, you could have come to that conclusion. That conclusion has been reached before that baby had that conflict with the reality on the ground, right?
Right.
Similarly, to be fair to Christianity, I think I mentioned those aspects of suffering throughout the Bible, but that I don't think is inconsistent too. There's sort of an embrace of the suffering, right? The idea that to live a moral life, you have to bear a cross, right? Even in John 3:14 through 15, right? It talks about erecting Jesus to lift up the Son of Man in the same way that Moses did with the staff with the snake on it, right? In this way of look directly at the suffering, right? Embrace it directly. Maybe that's some way, both in the Buddhist context of making it the first noble truth, and in the Christian context of erecting the crucifix, a way to prevent that mismatch. That in the first place, you're confronted with the suffering from the outset.
Yeah, that's a nice way of presenting these ideas. So arguably, many or most religions focus on suffering in the world. So, I have met many theists who would say that actually there is no problem of expectation mismatch for us, because we expect that the world is full of suffering, and that's why there is religion. I'm inclined to agree with that, because philosophical atheists assume that evil is evidence against religion. But in a way, religion exists because life is full of pain and suffering. So there's my favorite Catholic novelist called Shusaku Endo, and he says that when we encounter, when you see a child who have to suffer and die, you will feel like there is no God and no Buddha, no hope whatsoever. But he says that this is not the end of religion, but this is a very start of religion. We need religion precisely because it looks like there is no God, no Buddha.
Yeah. And again, to be fair to Christianity, I think that element is confronted directly, right? In the Gospels of Mark, usually the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, where Jesus Christ on the cross himself, right? So it's famous, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? So in some ways, it's a consistent, right? That you're going to face this, you got to deal with it anyway. So maybe that's some way God or the Buddha, in the Buddha's case, wants to inoculate us to the problem, to the expectation mismatch.
Yeah. So in a way, it's curious that philosophers tend to think of, okay, there's a problem of evil, and this is the end of theism. But probably many ordinary believers, they would say that that's exactly the wrong way of looking at the problem.
I like that. Cool. Well, anything else you'd like to say by way of closing this off?
Yeah, again, I would like you to read the book. It's free.
Yes, no, it's a great book. It's available online. What's the easiest way? Because I know you shared it on your Facebook, the link to the Oxford page.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, if people search up, you better find it. The problem of evil.
The problem of evil for atheists. And yeah, if you go to the website of Oxford University Press and search it, you can find it, and you can download a whole book in PDF for free. So yeah, please download it and read it.
It's good stuff. Highly recommend it. Well, alrighty, Professor Yujin Nagasawa, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Cool.